It's September 1967 at a shipyard on the River Clyde in Scotland. Cunard chairman Basil Smallpeice walks along a concrete path next to Sir Michael Adine, Queen Elizabeth II's private secretary. The hull of a massive red and black ship towers over the men. It's the Q4, Cunard's latest liner, nearing completion, and the Queen herself is due to christen the ship at a ceremony later in the month. But a name for the vessel has still not been selected. Two men stop beneath the ship's bow, and Michael tilts his head back to take in its size. You know, Her Majesty is very much looking forward to the ceremony. She remembers her mother christening the old Queen Elizabeth back in '38. Have you chosen a name yet? There's one I have in mind, actually. Oh, good. We were beginning to get a little concerned. It is, perhaps unconventional, though. Oh? Well, if I were to have my way, I would christen her Queen Elizabeth II. And break tradition? Basil, how could you? Michael is referring to the British custom that only battleships in time of war can be named after reigning monarchs. Well, what other name could be worthy of Cunard's most magnificent ship to date? The whole world loves Her Majesty. It's the only thing that feels right. Well, I understand, and I agree with you. It would be apt, I think. Unfortunately, though, there are these traditionalists who might make a fuss. I can't imagine you'd want any sort of controversy to overshadow the launch. Well, no, certainly not, but perhaps there's a loophole. There usually is, I find. What if we simply called her the Queen Elizabeth? So, two Cunard ships named Queen Elizabeth? Well, they won't be in service at the same time. The old Queen Elizabeth is due to retire next year, and the Q4 won't be done with fitting out before then. There have been two Mauretanias and two Coronias in the past. I think a second Queen Elizabeth would be perfectly acceptable. Michael looks away from Basil to the ship, as if trying out the name in his head. Yes, all right, the Queen Elizabeth, then. It's a clever workaround, and Her Majesty will be pleased, I'm sure. But I'm almost reluctant to tell her. You know, there's something rather powerful about the fact that only you and I know this ship's name. So you won't tell anyone else? Well, except Her Majesty, obviously. No, I think it would be bad luck, I suppose, to let anyone else know before the christening. I think so. And I really can't afford much more bad luck right now. Later that month, Basil Smallpeice stood beside Queen Elizabeth II at the launch of the Q4. When it came time for the Queen to announce the new ship's name, she was handed a slip of paper with Queen Elizabeth written on it. But she didn't even read it before confidently declaring,
I name this ship Queen Elizabeth II.
Basil was surprised but delighted. The Queen had given the Q4 the name he'd always wanted, and it wouldn't be long before most people simply called the new liner the QE2. But whatever name it went by, for Basil and Cunard, the QE2 was more than just a new ship. It was a symbol of a new age, and it had to be a new success. From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is Business Movers. By the fall of 1967, Basil Smallpeice had been at the Cunard Line for over 3 years. When he took charge at the company, Cunard was a far cry from its glory days in the 1930s. Back then, Cunard had been at the cutting edge of technology, and its ships were as famous as movie stars. By the time Basil arrived, though, the company was fading. Its business had been almost destroyed by the emergence of the jet passenger plane, and losses were mounting. As Cunard chairman, Basil immediately implemented reforms to improve the company's bottom line. Ways of doing business that had served Cunard well in the past were jettisoned, as Basil tried to make the century-old company fit for the 1960s. Staff were laid off and ships were sold. But Basil knew he couldn't simply cut his way to prosperity. His long-term strategy rested on three main pillars. He hoped to streamline Cunard's cargo operations through containerization and expand the business into new routes through a partnership with the Australian government. And he planned a complete overhaul of the company's passenger fleet to allow Cunard to pivot more towards leisure travel. The grand liners of old were to be retired and replaced by a gleaming new flagship, and the Queen Elizabeth II, or QE2, was scheduled to enter service in 1969. She would be much cheaper to run than her predecessors and could spend half the year operating on the increasingly lucrative cruise routes. But each of Basil's 3 core strategic projects had already encountered difficulties, from complex startup costs to government bureaucracy and an almost disastrous shortfall in cash. All 3 projects had survived, but all 3 still had a long way to go and could easily fall apart before Cunard saw any benefits from them. Basil was anxious to give each project the best possible chance of success. He'd already traveled to the other side of the world, and now he decided to go where no other Cunard chairman had gone before, into a partnership with a rival foreign company, one that had been a thorn in Cunard's side for nearly 100 years. This is the 4th episode in our 4-part series on Cunard. Bon voyage. It's November 1967 in Southampton, 2 months after the christening of the QE2. Basil Smallpeice sits in the first-class dining hall of the France, the flagship of Cunard's rivals, the French Line. He looks around admiringly. There are enough tables for over 400 guests here, and above a grand central staircase, ornate columns soar up to a domed, cathedral-like ceiling. But the room is mostly empty today. Basil swallows his last bit of tarte tatin and sets down his fork. Basil's host is a 61-year-old man with thick, dark eyebrows and sharp features, the French Line's president, Edmond Lanier. Edmond delights in Basil's clear admiration for the room and his enjoyment of the dessert. So, how was that? So much better than your English puddings, no? Basil smiles, joining in on the fun. Well, it's no jam roly-poly, but I forced it down. Do not worry, Mr. Smallpeice. I would not dream of telling your colleagues how much you like our food. Enjoyed it. I overindulged. I may have to ask for a cabin next so I can take a nap. Well, I'm sure that can be arranged. We have enough which are free, unfortunately. Yeah, a problem I know all too well. But it occurs to me that a problem shared is, as they say, a problem halved. Edmund looks at Basil quizzically. Basil goes on. You see, in the past, our 2 companies delighted in mutual competition. There were more than enough passengers to go around, and, well, it spurred on both of our efforts, didn't it? But the days of our illustrious forebears have sadly passed. And now, here we are, both of us still running a weekly service to New York, and both of us selling barely half our cabins on every voyage. Yes, it is true. It grieves me to see it. 2 ships running half empty at the same time clearly isn't working. So why don't we do something about it? What is it you suggest? Cunard could sail to New York one week, and the French Line could follow the next. We'd alternate back and forth, and that way every week there would be one of our liners making the crossing east or west, but only one. We wouldn't be duplicating our efforts in a market that clearly can't sustain it any longer. Edmund leans back in his chair. Oh, I don't know, Basil. We're competitors, no? Rivals? How would it look? It would look like good business. And to be frank, I'm not sure either of us can afford not to team up. Edmund glances around at the cavernous dining hall, silently considering Basil's offer. It would be marvelous to see this room full of life once again. Is that a yes? Edmund smiles. Let us consult our boards, but yes. I think we can come to an arrangement. Well, that's wonderful. Please, let me shake your hand. The 2 men seal their deal with a handshake across the dinner table. Do you have time for a tour of the rest of the ship? From what you say, it might soon become much busier. Certainly, Edmund, I'd be honored. It is a beautiful ship. Edmund reaches for his wine glass. Good. But I think before we do that, we should toast. To new friendship. Basil raises his glass in return. To a new entente cordiale. Over the next few months, Basil Smallpeice continued to meet with Edmond Lanier to hash out the details of their new partnership. The 2 men decided that in the following summer of 1968, Cunard and the French Line would offer a joint transatlantic service using the old Queen Elizabeth and the France. If all went well, the 2 companies would then coordinate their schedules again in 1969, when the QE2 was scheduled to enter service. Basil was beginning to feel cautiously optimistic. After all the storms Cunard had faced, he could almost see the safety of port. Now he just had to steer the company home. Ever since Basil Smallpeice arrived at Cunard, he had kept a close grip on the company's finances. But at the beginning of 1968, Basil felt so confident about Cunard's future that he decided it was time to hand over some of the responsibilities. So Basil appointed 55-year-old Philip Shirley as Cunard's deputy chairman and new finance director. Philip had once worked for British Rail, and he was a forensic-minded accountant who Basil thought highly of. And Philip immediately made Basil's life easier. One of his first jobs was to help coordinate the sale of Cunard's remaining passenger liners. The Corinthia, Sylvania, Caronia, and the grand old Queen Elizabeth would all finish their scheduled passenger services for Cunard in 1968. Then they'd be transferred to new owners. In total, the 4 ships netted Cunard a much-needed £7 million at auction, or almost $200 million today. It was a windfall that further improved Cunard's recovering financial position. As a result, Basil and Philip agreed that the company could afford to reduce its outstanding loan from the British government to £20 million. That represented a cut of almost 20% in the company's debt to the British Treasury and considerably reduced Cunard's interest payments. Costs were also slashed on the North Atlantic by Basil's new deal with the French line. In the summer of 1968, Cunard began the joint service arrangement with its old rival. And just as Basil had hoped, it led to more ticket sales and higher profits, ensuring that the final travel season of the original Queen Elizabeth was a successful one. After losing £25 million in total on the passenger business between 1961 and 67, Basil had now managed to reduce those losses to zero. And with the maiden voyage of the QE2 scheduled for 1969, he hoped to finally move Cunard's passenger service from merely breaking even and into profitability. In the summer of 1968, one frustration at least still preyed on Basil Smallpeice's mind. For months, he had been in negotiations with the Australian government over the purchase of a stake in Cunard's cargo subsidiary, Cunard Line. Australia's Secretary of Trade and Industry, Alan Westerman, had seemed to like the idea when Basil suggested it, but the proposal had gotten repeatedly delayed by political wrangling. Finally, in August 1968, Basil heard from the Australian government in Canberra, and it wasn't good news. Alan Westerman informed Basil that Australia would not be taking a stake in Cunard. In the proposed deal, Cunard would still have owned the majority of the port line, and the ships would have sailed under a British flag. That was now against government policy. Basil was disappointed, but only briefly, because he realized there was a workaround. It would involve the Associated Container Transportation Consortium. The ACT was the joint venture he formed in 1966 that pooled the resources of several different British shipping companies and shared the costs of transitioning the cargo industry to container ships. And several of the companies involved in the ACT had an interest in trade to Australia. So the ACT had formed a separate venture called the Associated Container Transportation Australia, or ACTA, and it was this group that was Basil's ticket to a partnership with the Australian government. So long as an Australian shipping company was allowed to join the conglomerate and at least one of its container ships sailed under an Australian flag, then the Australian government was happy to join the ACTA. And this partnership wouldn't only involve shipping to and from Britain. The Australian government also agreed to include trade between Australia and North America in the deal. This was a big win for Basil. Previously, British carriers had only had a weak position on these routes, but now Cunard had been given an entry into a rapidly expanding market. By the time the partnership with the Australian government was made official, it had been nearly 2 years since Basil first approached Alan Westerman. So now Basil had just to hope that it would be worth the wait. In the meantime, he had another pressing matter to deal with on the passenger side of the business. The old Queen Mary had already left Cunard service and been sold off to the city of Long Beach in California. Now, after a final summer on the North Atlantic, it was time for the Mary's sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, to follow her into retirement. She too had been bought by Americans, and her new home was to be the city of Philadelphia. The Queen Elizabeth's retirement was a poignant memory for many at Cunard. The iconic liner represented the glory days of the company, and for 2 decades she had been the largest passenger ship afloat anywhere in the world, and was still a shining example of luxury transatlantic travel at its finest. But the Queen Elizabeth and her older sister Queen Mary were tied to Britain's history by more than just their commercial operations. Both ships had served diligently during World War II, and at the end of that conflict, their contribution to the war effort had been summed up by none other than Sir Winston Churchill himself, who said, "Built for the arts of peace and to link the old world with the new, the Queens challenged the fury of Hitlerism in the Battle of the Atlantic. At a speed never before realized in war, they carried over 1 million men to defend the liberties of civilization. To those who contributed to the success of our operations in the years of peril, and to those who brought these 2 great ships into existence, the world owes a debt that it will not be easy to measure. On November 6, 1968, the Queen Elizabeth officially retired from Cunard service. The next day, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the woman the ship was named after, visited Southampton to bid her namesake a final farewell. Accompanied by the Cunard board, the Queen Mother had lunch in the ship's veranda grill, a popular spot where countless celebrities and English nobility had dined during the 20 years the ship had spent crisscrossing the Atlantic. Basil was at this lunch, but he had little time for nostalgia or sharing stories of the past. It was Cunard's future that Basil was most concerned with, and that depended not on the Queen Elizabeth, but on QE2. Basil expected the new liner to begin her sea trials in less than a month, and the ship had to be ready for the following summer. That was peak travel season on the North Atlantic. But as this deadline approached, Basil began to worry. Concerning reports about possible delays were emerging from the shipyard in Scotland, and soon Basil would discover that the new Cunard ship wasn't just unfinished, she was unseaworthy. It's the early hours of December 28, 1968, at Basil Smallpeice's home in London, 7 weeks after the retirement of RMS Queen Elizabeth. Wearing his pajamas and a robe, Basil hangs up the phone in the hallway and rubs his eyes. His wife, Kay, has only recently returned from the hospital after being diagnosed with an incurable blood disease. Now Basil has been informed that the engines on the new QE2 have failed during a test cruise to the Canary Islands. It's an emergency, and Basil must decide whether or not to leave his sick wife to attend to the matter. Basil pads down the hallway to the bedroom to check in on Kay. She seems to be sleeping, and Basil is about to tiptoe away when Kay calls out. Who's that? No one. Wrong number. You go back to sleep. Do you typically stay on the phone with wrong numbers for 10 minutes? You were awake then. I'm sorry. That's okay. Kay turns on the bedside light and blinks. So who was it? It was the captain of the QE2. There's been a malfunction. 5 days earlier, the QE2 set off from Britain on a test voyage to the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. Hundreds of Cunard staff and their families were invited along, both as a thank you for all their efforts and as an opportunity to troubleshoot any problems on board. But these first passengers were horrified by what they found. Some cabins, crew quarters, and public lounges were still unfinished, and tools, lumber, and dust were everywhere. Now, though, it seems that there are more than just cosmetic problems with the new ship. There's been a malfunction, something to do with the engines. They're towing her to Las Palmas. No one seems to know what the issue is yet, but it's so bad they think we may have to reject delivery. Kay pushes herself up in bed and looks at Basil with concern. Oh, darling, I'm sorry. They want me to fly out tomorrow for a board meeting. But I can't leave you here. It's okay, I'll be all right. Kay, you're not well. I can manage. I'm just going to tell the board to fix it without me. Basil, no, you're not. Basil sighs. His wife knows him too well. Well, I do trust them with most things, you know, if it were anything else. But the QE2, it's so important to the future of the company. Basil, look, if you don't go, I'll have to listen to your constant phone calls and watch you pace around the house all day anyway. So please, go deal with it, and then come back to me. Basil looks into his wife's eyes adoringly. Oh, thank you. Besides, it's hardly the first time I've had to compete with a ship for your attention. Basil smiles. He's glad his wife hasn't lost her sense of humor. She pulls back the covers and swings her legs out of bed. Now come on, let's pack your things. Oh, I'm sure we can sleep a few more hours at least. No, darling, fetch your suitcase. You have a ship to rescue. Later that very morning, Basil Smallpeice boarded a flight for the Canary Islands, where the crippled QE2 waited in port. As Basil watched the sea slide by beneath the window of his plane, he wondered what he'd find on board the new liner when he arrived, and what he could possibly say to the dozens of reporters who had traveled with the ship to Las Palmas and were now expecting answers. When Basil Smallpeice landed in Las Palmas, he boarded the unfinished QE2 and went straight to the card room on the quarterdeck for a meeting with the company's other senior executives. The card room at least had chairs to sit in. They were a luxurious green suede that complemented the felt of the rosewood card tables. But even here, Basil thought he detected a thin coating of construction dust on the furniture, and the sound of work going on elsewhere in the ship couldn't be ignored. While the board discussed what the company should do, Cunard's engineers worked with the makers of the QE2 in order to determine the cause of the engine failure. If they couldn't figure out the problem, Cunard would have to refuse delivery of the ship and withhold all future payments to the shipbuilders. This would be disastrous. Basil had expected the QE2 to begin commercial service in under 2 weeks. A maiden cruise on January 10, 1969 had been heavily promoted in the press, and if the QE2 wasn't ready in time, it would mean that advertising had been a complete waste and all the tickets sold would have to be refunded. The board meeting in the QE2's card room lasted 8 hours before finally wrapping up at 4 a.m. There was no positive news, though. As well as the engine problems, Basil was told that 85 cabins on board were still entirely unfinished, and there were countless minor defects elsewhere that needed correcting. Basil's worst fear was coming true. The QE2 would have to cancel its heavily advertised maiden voyage. After snatching a few hours' rest, at 9:30 a.m., Basil held a press conference to brief the media on board about what had happened. He told the reporters that Cunard would refuse to take delivery of the ship as planned on January 1, 1969, saying, "Under no circumstances are we prepared to send the QE2 on a commercial voyage until we are satisfied that the standards she can offer are what she was designed for." Basil's words were quickly relayed to the crew of the QE2. The news wasn't so terrible for the staff. They would be retained on standby with full pay. But their salaries were another sunk cost for Cunard. In total, the company stood to lose over £500,000 as a result of this debacle, equivalent of over $13 million today. So as the QE2 limped back to England at 2/3 her usual cruising speed, the ship's surprise delay made newspaper headlines around the world. Luckily for Basil and Cunard, most reports were sympathetic to the company and blamed the shipbuilders for the issues. Basil and Cunard had made it clear they would not accept the new ship in its current state. So with Cunard's future, as well as the reputation of shipbuilding in Britain on the line, the shipbuilders immediately set to work. It was determined that the fault was in the turbine blades, an issue that should have been caught in early stages of testing. Still, the shipbuilders assured Basil that the delay would only be a few months. The QE2 would finally be ready in late April of '69. Basil was relieved, but still nervous. April would be just in the nick of time for the summer travel season. Any further delay would be catastrophic. This time, however, the shipmakers delivered on their promise. The turbine blades were fixed and the unfinished cabins completed. QE2 then made another shakedown cruise to the Canary Islands in April 1969, and this time, the new Queen passed her test with flying colors. At last, Cunard agreed to take delivery of the 65,000-ton ship ready for her maiden transatlantic voyage on May 2nd. Despite all the problems, Basil was delighted with the $70 million liner and confidently declared that the QE2 was the most superb example of the shipbuilder's craft the world has yet seen. The day before the liner's departure from England, Queen Elizabeth II visited her namesake in Southampton. She met with Basil, Cunard officers, and the ship's crew. Basil was delighted. He felt that the Queen's visit was the best possible send-off the new ship could have, and the next morning, the QE2 set sail for America with 1,500 paying passengers on board. When she reached New York 5 days later, the QE2 was welcomed by a flotilla of small ships, by fireboats shooting sprays of water, and by the cheers of thousands of onlookers. Countless whistles and horns echoed through the harbor as the new liner followed the route of her famous predecessors up the Hudson River to the Cunard dock. The QE2's maiden voyage had gone off without a hitch. And over the summer of 1969, Cunard's new flagship completed 11 more round voyages across the Atlantic, each one at a profit. The old queens of the Atlantic were gone, but now a new queen ruled the waves. The QE2 was not Cunard's only important maiden voyage in May of 1969. At the end of the month, the first container ship of the ACT consortium set off on its inaugural trip from Europe to Australia. It was a momentous occasion, the result of years of hard work and millions of pounds of investment. For Basil, it was a long-awaited step into the future for the cargo side of Cunard's business, And as more container ships were delivered, serving more routes around the globe, he was confident that the ACT could only grow. And it was Cunard's share of the revenues from the ACT that helped the company to its best results in over a decade. In 1969, Cunard posted total profits of £3 million. Basil was over the moon. His short-term cost-cutting had been painful at times, especially for the 3,000 Cunard employees who had lost their jobs. But Basil had successfully kept the business going until his long-term strategies could pay off. The threat of bankruptcy had hovered over Cunard for years. Now, though, the company could pay off more of its loan with the government, and Basil was at least confident that he had found a way for the century-old shipping firm to survive in the jet age. But while he celebrated these successes, Basil remained cautious. Cunard's profit margins were still slender, and its cash reserves were weak. He knew a slump in either the passenger or cargo market could leave the company vulnerable again. Basil might have steered Cunard to safety for now, but he had learned from his time at the company that a new storm was never far away. It's July 1970 at Cunard's headquarters in London, over a year after the maiden voyage of the QE2. Basil Smallpeice makes his way down a hallway and enters the office of his finance director, Cunard's deputy chairman, Philip Shirley. Basil has come to hear the latest forecast from the company's accountants. After last year's profits of £3 million, Basil is hopeful that Cunard can at least maintain its performance. He greets Philip enthusiastically as he takes the seat. Well, I've been waiting all morning to hear some good news. Well, perhaps you should come back this afternoon then, after you've heard some good news elsewhere. Oh, I don't like the sound of that. You're not trying to take my expectations down a notch, are you? I'm afraid not. Because I'm not expecting a miracle, even just a modest increase. Well, I'm afraid it's quite the opposite, Basil. It's not an increase at all. Basil's face drops. He's never been one to overreact, but he can't help feeling he's been punched in the gut. Unfortunately, our December projections have not come to pass. Both passenger and cargo figures are down, and we've had to revise our estimates significantly. How much? On the cargo side, we're down on the Australian routes, India as well. Atlantic cargo is holding up, but the QE2 is slipping back, and its first cruise season hasn't posted the numbers we hope for. Well, no, but she needs a little more promotion. The Americans have to get to know her as a cruise ship as well as a liner, and that's going to take some time. Well, yes, but the long and short of it is we're currently predicting profits £1 million lower than last year, and I think there's a serious risk we undershoot even that. Looking at these trends, to be frank, Basil, I wouldn't rule out another operating loss come the end of the year. Basil stares straight ahead for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Philip tries to find some words of comfort. But this is what the shipping industry is like, isn't it? It's cyclical. We're not the only ones suffering. I know there have been job losses at P&O, for instance, but of course they do have rather larger reserves than us, and they've not had to make the cuts we have, so there's more fat for them to trim. Anyway, Basil, I'm sorry. I wish I had better news to share. The share price will take a hit. I imagine so. And that will leave us vulnerable if this goes on. To take over? Yes. A recently profitable company where the hard yards of reform have been done, going through a temporary dip. If I were one of those circling sharks, I might try to take a bite myself. So would I. So what do you suppose we should do about it? Well, in all honesty, Philip, I just don't know. By 1970, Basil Smallpeice thought he had effectively restored Cunard to operational sustainability. But the accountant's report in July of that year showed that even Basil's best efforts might not be enough. Having hauled Cunard back from the brink, Basil now seemed powerless to stop the company sliding back towards disaster. Over the next several months, Basil Smallpeice kept a close eye on Cunard's stock price. He had long had a difficult relationship with Cunard's shareholders. When he first arrived at the company, many had regarded him as a novice, an airlines man who had no business in shipping. Later, he was criticized for not paying out more in dividends from the sale of assets. But when Cunard shares hit recent record prices, those critics had been mostly silenced. But Basil knew he had few loyal allies among the shareholders, and as Cunard's finances declined further over the course of 1970, its stock price sank lower and lower, and Basil's critics crept out of the woodwork once again. By January 1971, Cunard's share price had dropped by more than half. Basil knew that such a dip would make Cunard very attractive to investors looking to take over the company, and that many of Cunard's shareholders would support such a move. And in June of 1971, Basil's fears became reality. He received a message from the chairman of Trafalgar House Investments asking for a meeting. Trafalgar House was a property and construction conglomerate, but it was looking to diversify, and Cunard seemed to be the perfect fit. Trafalgar offered to buy out Cunard at a price of £1.85 per share. Basil wanted to oppose the bid, but his advisors told him that the only way to convince shareholders to reject the takeover was if he could show that the company's prospects were so bright that a higher share price could be achieved without the sale. But the company's own internal reports showed that profits in the years to come were likely to be meager at best. In these circumstances, there was little Basil could do but try to achieve the best price possible for the company. He managed to increase Trafalgar's bid by 30 pence to £2.10 per share, which Basil still thought was a bargain, but he couldn't stop the deal going through. On August 25, 1971, more than 130 years after Samuel Cunard began carrying mail and passengers across the Atlantic by steamship, the company that bore his name held its last board meeting as an independent firm. Shortly after the acquisition, most of the senior managers who had overseen Cunard's turnaround lost their jobs. Basil stayed on as a member of the new board for 5 months before he too left. The similarities between Basil's time in the airlines and shipping industries frustrated him. At both BOAC and Cunard, Basil had helped restore profitability. And at both companies, he had been forced out before he felt his work was done. Still, Basil took immense pride in the achievements of the 7 years he spent at Cunard. Not all his decisions had been popular, and he was dubbed Captain Courageous by some in the English press for the bravery of his leadership. But he had successfully reshaped a failing company and given it a chance to thrive in a new post-jet era. The same could not be said for many of Cunard's old rivals on the North Atlantic. They did not survive the technological disruption caused by the jet engine. The United States line stopped carrying passengers in 1969, and the French line became defunct in 1976. The Cunard Line, however, lives on to this day under the ownership of the American cruise conglomerate Carnival. The company has changed since the days of Basil Smallpeice. Cunard no longer operates any cargo ships, and Carnival's tenure has seen the retirement of the QE2 after almost 40 years of service. But there are still 3 modern Cunard Queens at sea, the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Victoria cruise ships, and the last true ocean liner in the world, the Queen Mary II. The fleet is set to grow again, though, in 2024, with the addition of Cunard's newest cruise ship, the state-of-the-art $600 million Queen Anne. Each of these grand ships boasts a sleek black hull and white decks, lined with the instantly recognizable Cunard red. These ships, and all who sail in them, owe a debt of gratitude to Basil Smallpeice. In the face of rapid technological change that threatened to destroy his company, Basil adapted, Cunard evolved, and Cunard survived. From Wondery, this is episode 4 of Steering Cunard Off the Rocks for Business Movers. On the next episode, writer and filmmaker David Ellery discusses the golden age of the ocean liner and how passenger shipping has continued to evolve since Basil Smallpeice left Cunard. If you'd like to learn more about Basil Smallpeice and Cunard, we recommend Of Comets and Queens by Basil Smallpeice, The Only Way to Cross by John Maxton Graham, and Transatlantic by Stephen Fox. A quick note about our dramatizations. In most cases, we can't know everything that happened, but all our reenactments are based on historical research. Business Movers is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Mohammed Shazib. Sound design by Molly Bach. Music by Lindsey Graham. Additional writing for this episode by Cody Hoffmuck. Associate producer Jake Sampson. Executive producers are William Simpson for Airship and Aaron O'Flaherty, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Marshall Louie for Wondery.